While quietly organizing books in the library, Bob Sullivan noticed the sounds from the corridors had changed. He'd been hearing these sounds for 8 years, but this time was different. 30 years of prison experience told him a riot was beginning. From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden expertise walking among us. The Riverside Correctional Facility stood like a fortress of concrete and steel against the Nevada desert, its towering walls and razor wire containing 2,400 inmates in what was considered one of the most secure maximum security prisons in the American Southwest. Inside the facility's library, Bob Sullivan arranged returned books with the methodical care of someone who'd spent 8 years creating a sanctuary of learning within an environment designed for punishment and containment. At 61, Bob moved with the quiet authority of someone who understood institutional dynamics, though his current role as head librarian suggested nothing more threatening than overdue book fines and reading recommendations. To the inmates who used his library, he was simply Mr. Sullivan, a patient educator who helped them pursue GED certificates, legal research, and the small intellectual freedoms that made incarceration more bearable. The guards and administrative staff knew him as a reliable civilian contractor who maintained the library with impressive efficiency and never caused problems or questioned security protocols. What none of them knew was that Robert Sullivan had spent 30 years managing correctional facilities throughout the Southwest, including 15 years as warden of maximum security institutions housing some of the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. At 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, Bob was processing returned books when he detected something that made him pause in his routine. The sounds of institutional life, the distant clanging of cell doors, the measured footsteps of guards on rounds, the controlled conversations of inmates during recreational periods, had shifted in ways that most people wouldn't notice but that Bob's decades of correctional experience told him indicated developing trouble. Institutional sound patterns were like fingerprints to someone who'd spent 30 years learning to read the subtle indicators of prison tension. The rhythm of voices, the frequency of movement, the energy level of conversations, all provided information about the psychological state of the inmate population. What Bob was hearing suggested rising agitation, increased grouping behavior, and the kind of controlled excitement that preceded coordinated action. In his experience as a warden, these audio cues were often the first warning signs of serious institutional problems. Bob set down his book cart and moved to the library's security station, where he could monitor communications and observe corridor activity through the reinforced windows. His trained eye immediately identified additional warning signs that confirmed his audio assessment. Inmates were moving with purpose rather than the casual patterns of normal recreational time. Guard stations were reporting minor incidents at an unusual frequency. Most concerning, several high-influence inmates were engaging in conversations with individuals they didn't normally associate with, a classic indicator of coalition building for coordinated action. Bob faced a decision that would force him to choose between the quiet anonymity he'd maintained for 8 years and the responsibility that came with recognizing a developing crisis that others hadn't yet identified. At 2:30 p.m., the decision was made for him. The facility's alarm system activated with the harsh klaxon that indicated a code-red emergency, the highest level of institutional crisis. Through the library windows, Bob could see guards running toward the maximum security housing unit, their radios crackling with urgent communications about inmate disturbances. All civilian personnel report to secure areas immediately, the public address system announced. Facility lockdown is in effect. All civilian personnel report to secure areas immediately. Bob's institutional training kicked in automatically. A code red during afternoon recreational period suggested either a major fight involving multiple inmates or the beginning of organized resistance. Either situation could escalate rapidly in a maximum security environment where inmates had little to lose and guards were significantly outnumbered. Instead of following evacuation protocols to the civilian safe room, Bob moved toward the library's communications equipment. His 30 years of correctional management had taught him that the first minutes of an institutional crisis were critical for determining whether a disturbance would be contained quickly or develop into a major emergency. Control room, this is library station. Bob transmitted over the facility's internal communication system. Request situation report on code red status. Library station, this is control. We have major disturbance in housing unit C. Multiple inmates involved. All civilian personnel should evacuate to secure areas immediately. Bob's experience told him that major disturbance in housing unit C was institutional language for a situation that was already beyond the control of the immediate guard response. Housing unit C contained 200 of the facility's most serious offenders, and any coordinated action by that population represented a significant threat to institutional security. Control, this is Bob Sullivan in the library. I have experience with institutional crisis management. What's the current status of containment efforts? There was a pause before Control responded. Mr. Sullivan, please evacuate to the civilian safe room immediately. This is not a situation for library personnel. Bob made a decision that would reveal capabilities he'd successfully hidden for 8 years. Control, I'm former Warden Robert Sullivan. I have 30 years of correctional management experience, including Riot control. If you need assistance with crisis coordination, I'm available. The radio fell silent for several seconds. Bob's claim to be a former warden seemed inconsistent with his role as a civilian librarian, but the specificity of his offer and his knowledge of proper institutional terminology suggested genuine professional experience. Mr. Sullivan, can you confirm your correctional background? Warden at 3 federal facilities, 1985 to 2015. Specialized in maximum security operations and crisis management, I can provide assistance with de-escalation protocols and containment strategies. Deputy Warden Martinez's voice came over the radio with obvious relief. Warden Sullivan, we need you in the command center immediately. Situation is escalating beyond our current response capabilities. Bob left the library and moved through corridors that were rapidly emptying as lockdown procedures isolated inmates and concentrated security personnel at critical points. His institutional knowledge told him that the facility's response was following standard protocols, but his experience suggested that standard protocols might not be sufficient for whatever was developing in Housing Unit C. When Bob reached the command center, he found Deputy Warden Martinez coordinating with security supervisors and external law enforcement agencies. The room's multiple monitors showed various areas of the facility, with particular focus on Housing Unit C where the disturbance had begun. Warden Sullivan, Martinez said, I have to admit we're surprised to learn about your background. What can you tell us about the current situation? Bob studied the monitoring displays with eyes trained by 3 decades of reading institutional crises. What he saw confirmed his worst fears and revealed problems that the current response team hadn't yet identified. Deputy Martinez, you're dealing with a coordinated uprising, not a spontaneous disturbance. The inmate behavior patterns indicate planning and leadership coordination that suggests this will continue escalating unless you implement specialized containment strategies. Martinez looked at the man who'd been working as a librarian, but was now providing analysis that demonstrated expert understanding of correctional crisis management. Warden Sullivan, what do you recommend? Bob moved to the facility communications console, his hands finding equipment with muscle memory developed during thousands of hours managing similar crises. First, you need to identify and isolate the leadership elements driving the coordination. Second, you need to establish negotiation channels to prevent escalation to hostage situations. Third, you need to prepare for extended containment operations that could last several hours. What followed was a demonstration of correctional crisis management expertise that none of the Riverside staff had ever witnessed. Bob's approach was methodical, psychologically informed, and devastatingly effective at de-escalating violence while maintaining institutional security. The inmates in Housing Unit C are responding to specific grievances that have been building pressure for weeks, Bob explained as he reviewed recent incident reports. This isn't random violence, it's organized protest with clear objectives that can be addressed through negotiation. Martinez watched in amazement as Bob implemented crisis management protocols with speed and confidence that came from decades of experience handling similar situations. How do you know what their objectives are? Because I've managed similar situations before, and inmate grievances follow predictable patterns when institutional conditions create pressure without outlet opportunities. Bob's analysis proved remarkably accurate. The Housing Unit C disturbance was indeed organized around specific issues: inadequate medical care, restricted family visitation policies, and perceived unfairness in disciplinary procedures. Deputy Martinez, I recommend establishing direct communication with the inmate leadership and demonstrating willingness to address legitimate grievances through proper administrative channels. Is that safe? Won't negotiation be seen as weakness? Bob looked at the monitor displays showing tense standoffs between guards and inmates throughout Housing Unit C. Deputy, negotiation from a position of strength is the most effective way to resolve institutional crises without casualties. The alternative is extended confrontation that escalates to serious violence and potential loss of life. Over the next 4 hours, Bob Sullivan demonstrated why experienced wardens were considered among the most skilled crisis management professionals in the correctional system. He not only prevented the Housing Unit C disturbance from spreading to other areas of the facility, but successfully negotiated resolutions to the underlying grievances that had caused the uprising. Warden Sullivan, Martinez said as order was gradually restored throughout the facility, this was remarkable crisis management. How did you maintain communication with inmate leadership while ensuring security wasn't compromised? Bob was reviewing post-incident reports to ensure all security protocols had been properly restored. Deputy, successful riot control depends on understanding that inmates are people with legitimate concerns, even when they express those concerns through unacceptable methods. Address the concerns while maintaining firm boundaries about acceptable behavior. Martinez was studying Bob with growing respect and curiosity. If you have this level of correctional expertise, why are you working as a librarian? Bob looked around the command center where he'd spent the afternoon preventing what could have been a major correctional disaster. because after 30 years of managing prison crises, I wanted work that involved helping inmates grow and learn, rather than controlling their behavior through security measures. But you clearly still have the expertise to handle emergency situations. Having the expertise and wanting to use it daily are different things. I found peace in library work because it let me serve the inmate population in a positive way, without the constant stress of security and discipline responsibilities. And today I made an exception because people's safety was at stake, and I had knowledge that could help resolve the crisis peacefully. But tomorrow, I'll go back to helping inmates with their reading and education goals. Over the following weeks, word of Bob's intervention spread throughout the correctional system. The Federal Bureau of Prisons requested detailed reports on his crisis management techniques, and several major facilities offered him consulting positions at warden level. But Bob Sullivan returned to his library routine, content to let others handle the recognition while he maintained the educational programs that had given him satisfaction for 8 years. Bob, Deputy Martinez asked during one of his regular library visits, "Don't you miss the authority and importance of warden responsibilities?" Bob was helping an inmate research legal procedures for appealing his conviction, the same type of constructive assistance he'd provided for 8 years. "Deputy, there's nothing exciting about knowing that a management error could result in violence, injuries, or loss of life. I found excitement in work where the biggest crisis is a book shortage. But your expertise could prevent future riots and save lives." Bob paused in his legal research assistance to consider a question that several people had asked since the Housing Unit C incident. "I spent 30 years using my correctional expertise to manage prison crises and maintain institutional security. I trained younger wardens, developed crisis protocols, and handled more riots than I care to remember. Now I use different skills to help inmates develop education and job skills that reduce recidivism. Both forms of service matter, but you're one of the most experienced wardens in the federal system, and I used that experience for 30 years of direct correctional management, then applied it once when an institutional crisis required specialized knowledge. I don't need to return to daily warden duties to fulfill my responsibility to correctional safety." 6 months later, Bob's crisis management techniques were incorporated into Federal Bureau of Prisons training programs for wardens and security supervisors nationwide. His approach to riot de-escalation became a textbook example of effective institutional crisis management, but Bob remained characteristically modest about his contributions. "I just applied standard crisis management protocols to help resolve a tense situation," he would say when asked about his role in preventing the riot escalation. Riverside Correctional Facility implemented several policy improvements based on Bob's recommendations about addressing inmate grievances before they escalated to coordinated protests. The facility's incident rate decreased significantly following his intervention and policy recommendations. Warden Sullivan, the facility administrator, said during a ceremony recognizing his contributions to institutional safety, "Your intervention prevented what could have been a serious riot with potential casualties. Have you considered returning to correctional administration?" Bob accepted the recognition gracefully, but remained firm in his commitment to library work. "I'm honored by the recognition, but I found satisfaction in this job that I never had during my warden career. Every day, I help inmates develop skills and knowledge that support their rehabilitation and successful re-entry into society. But your expertise could improve correctional safety across the entire federal system." My expertise did improve correctional safety for 30 years of direct administration and through my analysis of this specific crisis. Now I want to contribute to correctional goals by helping inmates develop the education and skills that reduce their likelihood of returning to prison. 3 years later, when correctional administrators gathered for conferences on institutional security, Bob Sullivan's crisis management techniques were studied as examples of effective riot prevention and de-escalation. But Bob himself remained absent from these professional gatherings, content to continue his library routine. His story became legendary in correctional circles. The warden who'd walked away from administrative authority to find purpose in inmate education, then emerged from retirement for one crucial afternoon to prevent a major institutional crisis. But Bob preferred the version of his story that his library users knew, a dedicated educator who helped inmates pursue learning opportunities and occasionally demonstrated unexpected knowledge about institutional procedures. The most important thing, Bob would tell new library staff, is understanding that every position in a correctional facility contributes to rehabilitation goals. Whether you're managing security or providing education, you're helping create environments where people can change their lives for the better. He'd learned something important during his transition from warden to librarian. True correctional service wasn't about the authority of your position or the recognition you received. It was about using whatever skills you possessed to help people develop better lives. Experience is a responsibility, he would explain to young correctional administrators who sought his advice. But it's also a choice about how you want to serve others. I chose to serve differently, but I never stopped working toward correctional goals. Sometimes the most skilled prison administrators are helping inmates with legal research in facility libraries, quietly supporting the rehabilitation programs that make institutions safer and more effective. Sometimes the person who knows every inmate's reading level once managed entire correctional systems. Sometimes the librarian who never raises his voice has prevented more institutional violence than most wardens ever face. Bob Sullivan had spent 30 years managing maximum security facilities, then 8 more years helping inmates develop the education and skills that reduced recidivism. When institutional crisis threatened lives and safety, he proved that true correctional professionals never really retire. They just find different ways to serve the goals of justice and rehabilitation. Have you ever discovered that someone's administrative background was far more impressive than their current position suggested? Tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story reminds you to appreciate the correctional professionals around you, subscribe to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden expertise. Because sometimes the person helping with your legal research once managed entire prison systems, and when institutional crises threaten safety and order, that experience might be exactly what prevents violence and saves lives. This story is a work of fiction created to honor the spirit of correctional service and the dedicated professionals who work toward rehabilitation and public safety. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.